Hello and welcome to the World Extreme Medicine Podcast. I am Stephen P. Wood, your host for today's session. I'm a critical care and emergency medicine nurse practitioner and World Extreme Medicine Fellow, and I'm very excited to have you joining us today. I'm delighted to introduce our guest today, Lisa Sluijs. Welcome, Lisa.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Oh, we're excited to have you. And I think this is a great topic, and I think one that's going to be of real interest to all of our listeners. And I think there's a lot for us to learn from what you're going to share with us today. But I want to start with Lisa. Tell us a little bit about yourself and some of your experience.
Yes. So I am originally from the Netherlands. I grew up in Groningen, a city in the north of the Netherlands. I also have German and partially in German as well in the past 2 years. I am a senior at Harvard College. I study government and Middle Eastern studies. And outside of academics, I'm very interested in anything outdoors and traveling. So I love sailing, skiing, hiking, running, biking. I try to backpack whenever I can and be outside whenever I can.
Great. And Harvard, as many people will know, a fairly esteemed college and university here in New England, in Cambridge, which is just outside of our largest city in Boston. How have you found the Northeast for backpacking? Have you done some of our White Mountains or any hiking up in that area or Vermont?
I have done quite some hiking in the area. Not necessarily backpacking, mostly through the Harvard Outing Club, and they organize a lot of day trips in the area. So I've done a lot of that. I did a little solo trip to Montreal a few years back, but other than that, I haven't really backpacked here. I would say the backpacking infrastructure in the Northeast or generally in the US is not super easy, and also the country's quite big, so it takes you a while to get from place to place. But I've definitely enjoyed the nature in the Northeast.
Well, great. I'm glad to hear that. I cut my teeth on the White Mountains of New Hampshire and spent a lot of time hiking and backpacking, including some winter camping in those ranges. So I definitely hope that you get a chance to see some of those. But we'll get back to that. It's interesting to hear you say that there are some significant differences, and we'll talk about that here again soon. But why you're on today is you recently were part of a seminar on backpacking solo as a female that you held at Harvard. And I wanted you to tell us a little bit about why there was a need for you to present this topic and to discuss this topic. And then I'm hoping, you might share some of your personal experiences on that topic. And we'll discuss that again a little bit more. But what was the onus for, feeling a need to discuss backpacking solo?
Yeah, so this is an event I actually came up with myself and thought would be really interesting for the Harvard community. I think it was because this summer I spent 2 months backpacking the Balkans, so Southeast Europe, and I documented some of my travels on Instagram or social media and shared it with my friends, and I got a lot of questions on backpacking as a woman by myself. If that's not scary, if that's dangerous, if my parents let me do that. And also while I was backpacking, I got into a lot of conversations with people who asked similar questions. And I think in general, there is a debate in society on solo female travelers and if that's something that they should do or we should do, and whether or not if something happens, if that's our fault or if that means that we should not go out ourselves. And I think that's a very interesting discussion, and it was a discussion that I hadn't heard happening at Harvard so far. And so I figured if no one talks about it, then I will just set up my own event about it. So partially it was that, but then also because I heard so many people who told me, especially women, that they were also really interested in traveling by themselves, but they just didn't know where to start. How do you plan it? What sort of transportation do you do? How do you take care of your safety? And so I wanted the event to be partially in discussion on the topic of solo female travel generally, and then partially also some sort of solo backpacking 101. So what do you plan? What do you do while backpacking? What do you need to take into account? And just walking people through the steps of planning a really cool trip. That were my main motivations. I think generally the reason why I'm so passionate about solo travel and solo female travel is because it is one of my favorite things to do, and there is so much you learn from it, and so much I've gained from traveling personally, that I think it's an experience that a lot more people should be having. And I also just really, really hope to encourage people through talking about it more to actually take the step and maybe travel solo themselves as well.
No, I think that's great, and I think it really brings up the topic of gender equity. I mean, if I throw on a backpack and go backpacking through the White Mountains or wherever, no one's going to think twice about that. But you brought up some good points about people really questioning, safety, and questioning, should you be doing, solo backpacking, and it shouldn't really be an issue around gender equity. It should be an issue of, if this is something you enjoy, you should be able to do it. And I had a really good conversation recently with Julie Rack, who talked about gender equity in mountaineering, and how oftentimes those individuals have been overlooked by society. We're told they couldn't do the same kind of mountaineering that men did. Was there something about equity that you have thought about with regard to backpacking, or is it just that you just kind of wanted to talk more about your experience and how to safely do it?
No, there's definitely some sort of equity involved, especially also because the event was part of Women's Week, which is a week long sort of series of events organized by the Harvard College of Women's Center. So the female identity aspect was quite central to it, and I think in general, when we talk about the topic of women traveling, I think often what you will see in the media, or when you Google female solo, female travel, is you see a lot of horror stories of women backpacking alone going wrong, of solo female travelers getting attacked, murdered. And then often the articles after an event like that talk about questions like, well, why was she alone here in the first place? Why was she hiking by herself in the woods anyway? Or why did she travel to this city in the Middle East by herself anyway? She should have known that that's dangerous, and she should not have done that, or she should not have been alone. And I think that sort of emphasis, first of all, is very much victim blaming, right? Because it's not the fault of the woman, or anyone for that matter, that that something happens. And second of all, by saying those kinds of things, you're kind of discouraging women as well to go out. And quite frankly, there's no place in the world that's safe for women. And that's very, very unfortunate. But that doesn't mean that we should change our behavior for that. That means that there's a much larger issue in the world that needs to change. And so blaming women or questioning women traveling, I think, is a very wrong thing. And but that's still a thing that's going on, and that you see happening in media and in discussions in society. And so I figured that I also wanted to do an event to sort of counter that sort of perspective.
No, I think your perspective is important, and that's why we have you on today, which is to discuss this bigger global issue of just safety in general for women, not just backpacking, not just hiking, or traveling, but just in general, kind of our general attitudes towards, women being able to be out alone, doing something, anything. And that's a bigger global issue. And it's great that you were able to, discuss that issue in that platform. And I'm hoping, our discussion leads to bigger discussions here today as well in our community, which, has many people that love the outdoors, and for, any one individual to not be able to feel safe doing this, that's a tragedy and a travesty. And, anyone should be able to feel that they can go pick up a backpack and get out there in the woods, get up there in the mountains and enjoy themselves. So you bring up a great point, and I'm very glad that we have this opportunity today. Have you had any personal experiences that you mentioned? A lot of your own friends were questioning, the safety, and have you had any personal experiences that you are willing to share with us in your travels?
You mean of feeling unsafe?
Of feeling unsafe, or of or even just questioning yourself and your own safety. It's certainly, I don't want to re-traumatize you if there's been something of that nature, but if you're willing to share with us, what your experiences have been in your own personal experience, I think it'd be, something our audience would be interested in hearing. Certainly, if you're not comfortable, we can just generalize.
No, I'm happy. I mean, I'm lucky in the regard that I haven't had any really bad experiences traveling by myself, and um, I mean, I think like there have been unpleasant experiences while I was traveling, also while I wasn't traveling. I guess that's unfortunately still part of being a woman. But I think, I mean, traveling, there's been different instances. So, for example, I generally don't really hitchhike by myself, but there have been situations where that was sort of necessary or more convenient. So I would hitchhike, and I've entered a car with one man only, and then after driving for a while, the man would sort of ask if I wanted to go out for a date or for a drink, and you're in a car with that person, so you're not really sure if you saying what will happen if you say no in that situation. And so usually when questions like that start to come up, I will quite like directly say, I have a boyfriend. I'm sorry, even though that's not true. I don't have a boyfriend, but I will just say that because it's an easy way out, I think. Um, I will say, like, I have a boyfriend. I'm sorry. And also, you drove me far enough. Can I get out here now? And luckily, that was always the case. So I could always get out in those situations. So that is good. I think another funny story about when I sort of felt scared, which actually shows more the goodness of people, was when I was traveling in Jordan in the south, in Aqaba, close to the Red Sea, and I was trying to get a taxi back to the inner city to get a bus back to Amman, where I was interning at the moment, and there were almost no taxis on the road I was at. I had just been snorkeling somewhere, and a car stopped with four adult men in the car, and they asked if I needed to drive back to the city. And there weren't any taxis, and it was 40 degrees Celsius, very hot. I'm not sure what that's in Fahrenheit, but it was very hot. And so for some reason, I sort of trusted the situation. So I said, yes, okay, thank you. I would like to get a ride back. And so I got into their car, and then after driving for a while, they actually went the opposite direction of where the city center was, and it didn't really seem like they were coming back. They were going back to sort of drop me off. So at some point I started to get a bit scared, because I think at that point I very started to internalize all the stories I had heard and the things people tell you when you're traveling by yourself. Like, first rule would probably like, do not get into a car as a girl alone with like four adult men. And so I started to get a bit scared in that situation. And at that point, I also didn't really speak Arabic that well. The man in the car didn't really speak a lot of English, and so our communication was quite limited. And but they started to. I started asking questions like, okay, when are we going to go back to the city? When am I going to, get my bus? Because they kept on stopping at the road, like picking up a different man, dropping off another man, and I was very confused. And so they started to notice that I was a bit scared. And so what the driver did, was he pulled out his phone and started showing pictures of his daughters, sort of in sort of a universal way, I guess, without language, to show that, don't worry, I have daughters too. I care about the safety of girls, or something like that, which in fact calmed me down a bit, because, yeah, somehow I figured, if this man has two daughters, he won't do anything bad to me. And so we kept on driving a bit for a while. But after a while, we still didn't get closer to the center of the city. And I asked again, like, are we going to go back? I need to catch my bus. And they said, oh yeah, we're going back soon. We just need to get to Saudi Arabia, which is close to the Saudi border. And at that point, I started to stress out again, because I did not have a visa for Saudi Arabia. I also was not planning on going there. I thought it was going to look really strange to border patrol if I would just enter that country with four men I didn't know. And so I was again a bit worried. And then we ended up driving really, really, really close to the border, and then picking someone up, dropping someone else off, and then turning around. And then we actually drove all the way back to the city center, and they dropped me off, and I got my bus, and everything was fine. And they were all great and really nice people, but it was a very interesting dynamic, sort of, where when I got into the car, I wasn't worried. I think somehow intuitively I trusted the situation. But then when I sat there and I was thinking about everything people say about traveling, and I could already see the headlines of like, girl gets into a car with four adult men and disappears, or, um, and thinking that I was really stupid for doing that. So I think, and generally, I think the what I've learned from traveling is, for every bad person or a person that makes you feel uncomfortable, there are 10 good people. For every one person that's bad, there's like 10 good people, and 10 people that help you just from the goodness of their heart and who have no benefit from helping you. But that was, I think, a funny story of how some sort of like what other people tell you about the dangers can also become internalized, but may not always be wrong.
No, that sounds like a harrowing story. And yeah, certainly traveling to another country while hitchhiking seems like it could be problematic. Thankfully, I have about a 0% success rate hitchhiking. So you one upped me there for sure. So I'm sure you learned from that experience, and you, it sounds like you had a lot of experience and were able to take these experiences and bring them to an audience to share. What are some other things that you can share with us? What are some of the tips and advice you gave during the seminar that you recently gave on backpacking solo as a female?
Yeah, I think it's quite general on planning a trip, looking where you want to go. So for me, I like to backpack solo. I'm also on a budget. I'm a student and I fund all my travels myself. And so money is a very important factor as well. I think that's also generally important when you talk about safety, because it's easier to ensure your own safety when you're spending more money. You could, for example, take an Uber from a place to another place instead of walking or taking public transport. You could stay in a fancy hotel with security. I don't have the money for that, so I will take public transport, or I will walk from place to place. I will stay in hostels, usually in the largest dorm they have, which means you're in a room with 14 other people. Oftentimes, most of those other people are men, because sometimes they also have female dorms, but then they may cost a bit more. And so I will always go for the cheapest option. So for quite a lot of times this summer, for example, I would sleep in large dorms, 10 to 14 people, and I would be the only girl in the dorm. So that's what I tell people to consider, the budget you have and what you want to do with it. But also other things, I think, generally, is how much do you want to plan in advance. I'm a very proponent of not planning too much. So you could, if you have a trip for a few weeks, for example, you could plan beforehand for every single night where you're staying, what you're going to do, how you're going to get there. um, that could work if that makes you feel more at ease. It's also a personal preference. I would say, generally, if you leave things a bit more open and don't plan everything too tightly, first of all, you will have the opportunity to run into spontaneous situations that are really fun, and you actually want to stay longer, and you have the possibility to stay longer because you haven't planned all your days in advance, and you can just see day by day what you want to do. And also, I think being more flexible um, puts you in less stressful situations. So there's been times where I had missed a bus or a train wouldn't go, and instead of getting really stressed out and worrying because my whole schedule relied on that one bus or that one train, I was able to just say, okay, well, I guess then I'll just stay in the city a day longer. And I think if you keep that sort of lower stress, more relaxed mindset, you also will likely be less likely to run into situations where people take advantage of you. I think if you're really pressed on time and you really need to be somewhere, the chance that someone wants to take advantage of you in that situation by offering you like a really, really expensive ride somewhere or so, it's larger. So I always tell people, although I try to talk about how to plan for your trip, I also tell them not to plan too much, because that's pretty important. I think other things to think about is obviously what you bring. So and this again, I try to not tell people too much what they should or should not do, because I think this very much depends on personal preferences. So I'm not someone who brings a lot of those like safety gadgets, I guess, with me. I mean, something like pepper spray is not even allowed in most European countries, so I don't have that with me. I know some like female travelers in the US may bring that with them, and if that makes them feel more safe, then they should absolutely do that. I never considered it. I also don't have a whistle or anything with me. I said during the seminar as well. I happen to bring a knife with me, but that's more because I really like eating fruit and I want something to cut my fruit with when I'm on a train. I never considered that knife as some sort of instrument of self defense. But if you would feel like having a knife with you in case you may need it in some sort of self defense situation, then that's absolutely what you should do. It's all in your personal preference. Um, yeah, I think general backpacking things like where do you keep your money, where do you keep your valuables? Preferably, don't bring too many valuables. Is quite important to traveling. Look where you're going. So destinations definitely matter. Do you speak the language of the destination or not? Is it far from home or not? Is the country where you're going to travel similar to your home country or the country you're living in or used to or not? That also matters. I generally encourage people to who travel for the first time by themselves. You know, like wouldn't say don't go too crazy. Don't go somewhere that's super different from your home, because that might be a bit too much for the first time. I really like other places and cultures and regions than the ones I grew up in. But it's also something that you may want to ease into. I'm also very fine traveling in places where I don't speak the language. I feel like there's always a way around that, and especially nowadays with Google Translate and things like that, you always have options if you can't find your way in any language you speak. But those are also, I think, important things to consider when
Sure.
people travel. Yeah.
Now, you mentioned, I think it is also a good idea to be a little bit flexible with your schedule when you can. Do you, though, communicate with someone about your whereabouts? Do you normally let someone know, hey, I'm here, I've made it here? Do you feel that that's something that's been an important part of your experience, or is something that you'd recommend to others to make sure that someone knows your whereabouts and how to get in touch with you?
Yeah, that's actually a good question, because that's something I've changed recently. I think before, so before the summer when I would travel by myself, people would no one would really know where I was. My parents and friends would probably know the country, perhaps the city, maybe not the city where I was, but not really. And then this summer, when I backpacked for 2 months myself, I figured that it may actually be smart that there is someone in the world who knows where I'm staying or where I am approximately with regards to city and country. And so what I would do is I would usually stay in a place for like 3 or 4 or 5 days. So I would message my parents which city, which country I was in, and then which hostel or like couch surfing address I was staying at. That was basically it. Not a lot of other whereabouts. So sometimes they wouldn't hear from me for 3 or 4 days. Um, that works for me. I feel comfortable with that sort of safety, but I also know travelers who share their GPS location with someone at all times, so that there's someone who can find them at all times. And I think especially if you're so often when I backpack, I'm not in super remote places. So I know that there will always likely be people around. But if you're backpacking in nature, and it's unlikely that you will see anyone for a week or so, I think it's definitely useful to somehow share your location, either once in a while or continuously, whatever is your own comfort level. But in that case, if something happens to you, then it's nice that someone knows where you are approximately. And yeah, and I think in general, it's a good way of checking in with people every once in a while. But this is, yeah, again, it's a personal preference thing, right? I'm very comfortable not um, saying specifically where I am every day. But if that makes you feel more safe, if doing that makes you feel more safe, then it's absolutely something you should do.
Sure. And of course, pepper spray also can be a really great seasoning on food sometimes. Well, aside from, but all kidding aside. So you mentioned though, traveling to different countries, and I want to get back to the equity piece of that. Are there countries that you've been to or that you won't go to because of the way that women, especially solo women travelers, might be treated? And in some countries, it might not even be allowed for a woman to be unaccompanied. Have you had that experience, or what can you speak to? How can you speak to that experience?
Yeah, I haven't had that experience. But I have a lot of people asking me on that specifically because I enjoy traveling in the Middle East, and I think a lot of people regard the Middle East as a place that's quite hostile to women. Um, I think there's two. I think two things are important to say for this sort of question. So first of all, there's very much a difference. But so if people will look at countries that are safe for women to travel, often what they will find is like the rate of violence against women. But important to note is that this rate of violence against women almost always um, is made up largely by domestic violence, and that's absolutely terrible. But that means that that's not something you likely deal with as a traveler in that country. So even if a country has a high rate of domestic violence, it might not affect you personally a lot. So that's always where I think it's important to separate the two of those. And then second of all, I don't really believe in dangerous countries or dangerous regions. I think there are dangerous people, but dangerous people exist everywhere in the world. And so I I think women can travel solo anywhere in the world, and I think they should. Um, I've traveled in places in, I guess some people would consider a country like Jordan or a country like Lebanon or Palestine more dangerous for women, which I absolutely do not believe. But those are the kind of questions I do get when I say that I travel solo in those places. Um, I'm also planning to travel to Iran next year, for example, which is a country where a lot of people ask me about if that's even allowed as a woman or if that's not scary or dangerous. Um, I it's a hard question because I do not see it that way, but I also understand with the sort of images you see from a country, especially in media, that's maybe an impression you have. Um, for my experience, the experience I have as traveling solo in the Middle East compared to, like, let's say traveling solo in Europe is not different at all. In terms of being a woman, there's not a big difference in that. The only thing is that you might see few, fewer solo female travelers in those places than that you maybe see in Europe. But it for me, it never really affected my safety or my feeling of safety. Um, but yeah, that is again a personal experience. Obviously, there are precautions that you take as a woman. I usually don't go out by myself alone at night if I know that the area is quite deserted. But this is also an interesting thing. For example, like in some European countries, in at night, cities are really empty, and so I would feel quite uncomfortable walking around there alone at night. Whereas in a place like Istanbul, for example, in Turkey, the streets are still quite lively in the middle of the night, and so I have no issue walking around by myself because I know that there's people everywhere, and I'm never really completely alone, and so that also um, affects my decisions on my own safety. So will I go out? Will I not go out? And yeah, so I don't think I know in terms of like a country where women cannot really travel alone. I think Saudi Arabia until recently was a country where women were not allowed to travel without a male sort of chaperone. If I'm not mistaken, they actually changed that law. And I think as a tourist in general, you have a bit more opportunities there to travel by yourself, whether that's good or not, I think it's obviously not fantastic, but you could. And so I think, yeah, as long as like the country is not in a full-fledged war, I don't think that there's necessarily like a dangerous place where women cannot travel at all themselves.
And you seem to like to travel to warm places.
Yeah,
Is
I
that
mean,
true?
I like a lot of
Really
climates,
cold.
but warm places too.
Yeah. My wife and I have a deal because I like to go to cold port cities,
Mm.
like Boston, and others, and she likes like super warm climates, and so we switch back and forth. But yeah, but that's our deal for now. Although I'm starting to enjoy the warm climates as well. I see the appeal. Definitely see the appeal. So I want to then kind of come back to the equity issue, and so you held this seminar, and I think this would be wonderful for others to hold this kind of event as well. What were some of the things that you learned from this seminar? What were people's general feelings, general questions? What did you learn from holding that educational program?
Yeah, I think a lot of people had just general questions on very logistical stuff. That I was really surprised about. So just like, how do you do this? Where do you book your hostels? How do you know this? How do you find that? And so that I was quite surprised about, because I like, at some point I had those questions, but first I somehow figured out how to do those things as well. I think it's a lot of Googling and reading travel blogs and those kinds of things. Um, in general, I thought the discussions were really, really interesting. Something people asked a lot about as well is how to deal with parents that don't allow you to travel yourself. I mean, I'm 23 myself, and a lot of the people who attended were younger than I was, and so the influence of what your parents say or what your parents allow you to do or not is still quite important. It's a discussion that I don't feel super qualified to speak about, just because my parents are quite chill and just let me do whatever I want, and I don't really ask them for permission. I just tell them where I'm going, and they will tell me to have fun, and that's mainly it. But that's, I think, something to consider. The person I was presenting with, her parents were a bit more worried about her going places, so she had some good tips on what to tell your parents and how to get started. I think in general, what I also get a lot is that people ask if it's not lonely to travel by yourself. I think that's very much an assumption people make. Well, if you're traveling by yourself, you're always alone. It depends on where you travel by yourself. If you are going to go to the woods and in a remote place, then yeah, you might be by yourself for the whole time. And that may be lonely in sometimes, but I think that sort of loneliness can also be really good and really reflective. If you travel in more urban areas, like I often do, and you stay in hostels, you're hardly alone at any point, and there's always people to chat to and to talk to, and you meet so many new people, which is a really fun thing. But I always recommend people to start small. So you don't have to like go on a solo trip um, for 2 weeks to start. You can just go to a restaurant in your own city by yourself and see what that's like. So I think that I would recommend people also talking, like organizing events on a similar issue. Just tell people how to ease into the experience of solo travel, because it can seem quite daunting if you've never thought about it and you've never seen anyone doing it. So give them some tools on how to experience little parts of it or how to try it out for themselves. And then another thing that I think really matters for organizing an event like this is showing people that there are women out there who travel, and partially I did that by sharing my own stories, but also by linking some Instagram accounts or blogs of women traveling by themselves, also women from different identities, because I think that's something important to notice as well, right? My experience of traveling as a white woman is different from the experience as Black women have who travel, or someone who's a member of the LGBTQ community, or someone with a disability. And so find blogs from people that, like look like you or are like you, and they travel, because they exist. There are blogs of all different types of women and people in general who travel. So find them, and I think it can be really empowering to see that people have done it before, that people have had good and really really cool experience traveling by themselves. And I think that's another important part of organizing an event is showing that it has been done and that it can be done. And also I think showing that it's not always perfect. I think that's very important too. I try to really emphasize that even though I've had quite a lot of travel experience, it doesn't mean that everything goes well when I travel. I've showed up to bus stops and the bus would just not show up. I have gone to hostels that turned out to not really exist or be sort of closed. Um, so things go wrong, and that doesn't matter that you should blame yourself. It just means you should keep an open mind and be flexible and figure out how to go from there.
Yeah, that does happen where a hostel might not exist or a bus doesn't come. That happens here in the city of Boston, where never mind traveling. You just have to be flexible and have some contingency for how to deal with that. And the other, you mentioned hostels. You mentioned couch surfing. Actually, I was part of the couch surfing community for a long time.
Oh, good.
And yeah, it was a lot of fun. Got to meet a lot of people. And what I would often do is I had two rooms, and sometimes or many times people would come and be there at the same time. And it was a way for them to make new friends, to meet new people, to oftentimes then travel together and spend some time together traveling and doing some of that. And similarly, I know friends and colleagues who've stayed at hostels and met some people and maybe travel a leg together. And it's just a great way, I think, to meet people as well. It also, and you speak to this as well about being alone and having that time to reflect and time to be alone. Our culture internationally has become this, culture of we never want to be alone. We always have to have someone with us or something with us. It's usually our phone, and we're looking at Instagram or things of that nature. And there's just so much to be said, actually, I think, for just putting that phone down and being aware of your surroundings, not from just a safety perspective. I'm just saying for just bringing things in and, taking that time to really soak in a city, soak in the environment you're in, be it the woods or mountains, and just be comfortable with being there alone. And that can be really, in my opinion, really rewarding.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm also a slow hiker, so I like to, yeah. So being alone, I can at least, take my time as well. But
Yeah, and another thing I think is like I, for example, always will write a travel diary. So oftentimes I think we process our thoughts by sharing them with other people. But if you don't necessarily always have someone else to share them with, writing them down can be a really good way to process your thoughts as well. So I will always keep a travel diary in which I will write down just what I did during a day, who I met, where I went, what kind of food I had, what I saw. And that will not only help me just putting down words on paper, it's also a really nice way to later on look back at it and read through it and just sort of relive again the fun experience you had. And also it gives you a good way of just having something to do. I think I very much agree with you that we easily resort to our phones when we're by ourselves and we don't really know what to do with ourselves. For example, if you're going to a restaurant by yourself and you're waiting for your food to come, most people would just go on their phones. I don't really like that. And so what I will usually do in those situations, I will always bring a book or my travel diary. And so I will always just read when I'm waiting for my food or write when I'm waiting for my food. And it's a much more pleasant experience.
absolutely. Well, we're coming up on the end of our time together. I really value what you brought to the table today. I'm sure many of our listeners will as well. I wanted to ask you: do you have a blog or do you have an Instagram account that we can post on our show notes for people to follow?
So I have a very small Instagram account. It's called Lisa's Visas, where I started documenting the travels I did this summer. It's nothing big, but I think it definitely does show you a more realistic insight than some sort of fancy pictures because a lot of it is about things that go wrong, which is quite funny to read back on. So that you can absolutely share. I don't have a blog. I'm considering starting it. So you will hear from me if I actually do that. But for now, that's all I have.
Well, certainly. Well, thank you so much, Lisa. It's been a pleasure to speak with you. And thank you all of our listeners for joining us today. We'll certainly post in the show notes that Instagram account, so you'll hopefully be in the thousands and thousands of followers shortly after this. And we'll of course be looking forward to your blog as well. So thank you very much, Lisa.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
If you've enjoyed this episode of the World Extreme Medicine podcast, please subscribe, like, and share. And if you want to meet lots of other risk-taking, rule-bending, and inspirational people, then you need to be in Edinburgh on the 19th to the 21st of November for this year's conference. Tickets are on sale now. Go to extrememedicineexpo.com to find out more.